opportunity now. So am I right in saying that the annual average incomes will increase by about 77%? So from $66,000 today to about $117,000 in 2040, 54, 55? Is that right?
We'll check that the number's right, but if you
I think it's just including the GNI.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're talking the average Australian is going to be much wealthier. We're going to have a lot more high income earners in 2054, 55, that's right. And
so we don't. We only project the average, not the distribution.
okay,
Yeah.
all right. Well, if you have
on average, in 54,
Yes.
55 Australians will
Yes.
have higher national income per capita.
yes, it would be remarkable if that didn't occur. Let me ask this then: that if there's a no policy change basis, as you've described, that personal income tax revenue would have to rise faster than GDP.
So personal income tax revenue does rise faster
Yeah.
than GDP.
And that's obviously because we've got a progressive taxation
We have
system.
progressive
Yeah?
taxation system.
Yep. Number of high income earners increases, average tax paid increases. Is that right?
So I'll go back a second. Personal income tax rises higher than, faster than GDP with no change in the tax scale.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct. So if we account for inflation, in 2055, we can assume that there'll be more high income earners than there are today. Is that right?
On the basis of current policy, I think that's a reasonable.
I thought it was pretty straightforward. Yes.
Yeah. Well, so policy can affect that.
Yes, but you've assumed a no policy change basis.
Yeah.
So, and let's just say that, again, taking account of inflation, we would expect that there'd be a higher proportion of the workforce earning, say, 200,000 inflation-adjusted dollars. Just to pluck a number, but based on what I've just said, I think that's a logical conclusion.
Yes, and I think that we have published projections out for a decade that show that trend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But am I right in assuming, or am I right in saying that you have assumed that tax to GDP ratio is going to be steady between 2020 and 2055?
Yes, that's correct, and that's consistent with the approach we've taken, I think, in each IGR, and it's because that's sort of consistent with what government policy is.
So let me just get this right, because I'm trying to understand it. If you've got a tax to GDP ratio that's fixed between that period, and in your modelling, we're assuming that, again, after inflation, that someone earning $200,000 today compared to someone earning real inflation adjusted $200,000 in 2055, we'd have to assume that the person today is going to be paying more tax.
I think I'd need to think about that.
How can they not be?
I think I'd need to think about that because it would. It's going to depend on the number and distribution of personal income taxpayers.
But we've just agreed that there are going to be more people on that.
It's also going to depend.
You just said that.
It's also going to depend on what future governments do.
No, we're assuming a no policy change basis, and we're assuming that your tax to GDP ratio is fixed.
So I don't think
we're talking about the Intergenerational Report here.
Yeah, I know, Senator.
Yep.
So what we do in the Intergenerational Report is that we hold tax to GDP constant at 23.9.
Yes.
From the turn of the decade in round
terms.
Yes. And effectively what we assume is that each and every year from then on there are tax cuts, not necessary personal income tax cuts. There are just tax cuts.
Let's.
So it's not. So therefore, it's difficult to draw conclusions about what a person with a particular tax circumstance in today compared with 54, 55.
So you're saying there'll be no changes to taxation? You haven't modelled any changes to personal income tax?
We haven't modelled particular changes. What we've done is we've
Do you think it's realistic to assume there'd be changes to personal income tax scales?
Do I think it's realistic that sometime between now and 2054,
Yeah.
55, there's a change to the tax scale? Yes, I do think that's a realistic
And do you
assumption.
think? I mean, I'm just trying to work out how you get if you fix your tax to GDP ratio
Yeah.
for 30 years.
Yes.
You're talking about people like the average wage going from 66. This is in today's terms, $66,000 to $117,000.
Not the average wage, it's the average
Average annual income.
of the whole economy per capita. Yes.
Yes. Well, if you are talking about increases of that magnitude, the only way you can get to a model that assumes tax to GDP ratio is with significant cuts to income tax.
Significant cuts over that time to taxes. Correct.
To income tax. I mean,
Well, but there will be options available to future governments to adjust different taxes.
I suppose what I'm asking is,
But do we think that over time there will be adjustments to the personal income tax scale? I think our answer to that would be if there weren't, there would be very big negative impacts on participation. So we are effectively assuming over that 40-year period, if it wasn't changed. So we are assuming some changes.
So are you assuming that someone who earns $200,000 today compared to somebody who's earning $200,000 that's inflation adjusted in 2055 is paying the same or a lower level of tax?
We don't make particular assumptions like that.
Okay. So at this stage, you're suggesting that can you give me an example? Because we're talking about, again, just to be clear, if there was no change, we'd be talking about by 2055 something like an additional $150 billion in government revenue, increasing by tens of millions of dollars each year to a total of $150 billion by 2055. And you're here trying to argue that that there won't be significant cuts to income tax?
No, I'm not trying to argue that at all, Senator.
Well, I mean,
that's not what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing anything. What I'm saying is that in our projections,
150 billion. Can you give me another example of
a tax that
of
could
the
be
tax
cut?
cut that would raise $150 billion?
In 54, 55, company tax.
So are you suggesting that company tax could be? You're suggesting one possibility is that income taxes remain the same. That we bring in $150 billion of revenue by 2055, and that we abolish company tax.
I'm not saying that. Well, that clearly would be a scenario, but I'm not suggesting that would be a likely scenario. What I'm responding to is that we don't. All we do is that we effectively assume there will be some form of tax cut each and every year. Once we get to 23.9% of GDP, we don't allocate that to revenue heads.
Okay. Well, let me ask you then.
And because we don't,
Yep.
and therefore we don't.
All right. We're probably not going to get anywhere on that.
Yeah.
So, do you think that the integrity of the current personal income tax scales should be maintained in order to ensure?
Chair, it's a policy question.
Yeah.
Well, I'll ask. I think that's an answer. That's
So
something Mr. Ray can answer.
Yeah, of course you can, but it is a policy question.
I don't need your protection.
Do we think that over time there will need to be adjustments to the personal income tax scale? Yes, we do, and we're on the public record.
Okay. Well, we'll move on to another just point around tax to GDP and this question of superior goods. Do you agree that health's a superior good?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'll assume that. You're obviously aware that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that when providing healthcare services, they're most efficiently delivered through the public sector.
Oh, I'm not aware of evidence. I'd need to go and look at that.
I'm asking the question of Mr. Ray. Would you agree that there's abundant evidence that suggests that in many cases the public sector is the most efficient way of providing healthcare services?
I don't think I would. And I mean, in Australia's case, we have a large proportion of health services are provided in a mixed sector.
Yep.
Publicly funded but privately provided.
Well, let's leave that aside. Let's move to the question of, given that health is a superior good, as incomes are increasing,
Yeah.
wouldn't you expect that it would be what follows from that people are going to want to spend more on their health over time, given
Yes.
you've already acknowledged it's a superior
Yes.
good? Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Given that you've already acknowledged that it's a mixed system and that the government provides a proportion, and in our case in Australia, the majority of those services are delivered through the public sector.
Is that correct?
Yeah, it's absolutely correct.
Well, not if you include Medicare.
That's absolutely
CBS
correct.
system, they're all privately provided, they're publicly funded.
They're
There's a
funded.
distinction between-
Funded. Okay. Well,
Distinctly
funded through the
public
public. Funded by the public purse.
The majority is funded by the public,
Yes.
public sector.
Given that we've got a superior good, incomes are increasing.
Yes.
The public purse is responsible for providing funding most of those services. Why is it a bad thing if we spend more of our GDP on healthcare?
I don't think anyone suggests that.
Well, hang on. Through the report, through the intergenerational report, you've fixed tax to GDP ratio.
Correct.
And on one hand, you're saying we can't increase taxation,
I didn't say that.
the tax to GDP ratio.
No,
On one hand, you're assuming
no.
the tax to GDP ratio is fixed for the next 30 years. Yeah, we've got a superior good. Incomes are rising over time. Most of those are funded through the public sector, and yet you've made a decision to fix tax to GDP ratio. Why have you done that?
no. So successive governments have done it, and it's because that's consistent with their fiscal policy. But a way to think about this is that what the intergenerational reports do is that they show on the spending side, so on government spending side, they show pressures that will emerge through time as a result of a number of changes. One of those changes, that in large part, is because of demographic change. But in the case of health, this intergenerational report and the last intergenerational report were quite explicit that the bigger drivers to future health spending are not demographic change.
They're not age. It's not the
It's
ageing
not
population.
ageing, no.
Correct.
About 10%.
I'm pleased to hear you say that.
10% of the increase
is ageing.
Is ageing.
Yep.
And the other is things such as income growth and technological change.
That's right. Income growth because it's a superior good. So why wouldn't you make provisions for for changes to people's preferences over time? Why would we fix tax to GDP ratio?
So these
and
are,
at the same time, we've got clearly we've got a wealthier population whose preferences are changing. I mean, it makes sense.
So
the
these
wealthier you are, the more you spend on health. And yet you're saying we've got increases in the costs of healthcare, and yet we're going to fix tax to GDP ratio. Let me ask the question, then I'll let you answer it.
If you let me answer it, I'll...
But if you're putting all that work into the intergenerational report, why wouldn't you actually also factor in how people's tastes and preferences change over time?
So the issue here, Senator, is that a way to think about the intergenerational report is that it illustrates under certain assumptions using an analysis of current trends and current government policy what would emerge over the next 4 decades. It then, therefore, effectively poses some public choice questions. Since the first intergenerational report was published in 2002, those public choice questions are around, do you lift tax to GDP? So do you raise more tax? Do you cut spending elsewhere than in areas that are going to be driven by, such as health and aged care? Or do you do things which grow the economy faster? Or do you do things which grow the economy faster?
Sure. They're public choice questions. I acknowledge that.
They're the three.
So why would you only provide...
Can I raise a point of order?
You can raise a point of order.
Chair, you've been going now for 15 minutes. You said you'd have the call go round the room, and I think that's probably one of the longest stints from any particular senator. It's certainly the longest from our... We haven't had 15 minutes of uninterrupted questioning. Let's just put that on the record. Hang on, Chair, I'm trying to make a point of order. I haven't made it yet, and I'm trying to make it. I mean, what kind of committee
What's your
is
point
this?
of order?
My point of order is you did say earlier that you would rotate the call around senators, and you have been going for 15 minutes
And
now.
you had 15 minutes.
We never had 15 minutes in one go. We never had 15 minutes in one go.
No point
and
of
you
order.
said
there is no point of order.
Well,
there is no point of order. I'll continue on with that questioning. Mr. Ray, let me ask you just to finish on this point, and then Senator Dastyari wants to follow up. You've posed this as a public choice question, and I acknowledge that. There are some questions that this is a... So why would you only model one scenario where tax to GDP ratio is fixed, given that one of the scenarios you've just acknowledged is that we could increase income tax, or in fact increase income tax brackets according to inflation, where we would see significant increase in revenue without having to increase taxes in any other way? Why would you...
But hang on, if you increase it... Never mind.
Yep.
I don't want to debate the issue, but that would actually reduce revenue. But
If you're talking about people's wages increasing over time,
correct.
and we increase our tax brackets according to CPI...
Well, no, the tax brackets are fixed.
Yes, well, I'm saying if you increase them according to CPI over time to address bracket creep, you would still see an increase in government revenue, wouldn't you?
Correct.
So
But
why? That's one possibility.
It's a policy question.
But why have you only modelled one policy decision? If this is a question of choices, why are we modelling a scenario where tax to GDP ratio is fixed?
Because it's government policy not to increase taxes.
No, we just heard that this was a case of competing policy priorities and choices.
As I've said, Senator, in each of the IGRs, it has been government policy not to increase the size of government above a certain size. Over time, that number's varied a bit, but it's between 23 and 24% of GDP. And
so they're not choices at all. You're basically modelling one scenario.
No. We actually modelled on the fiscal side 3 scenarios.
One revenue scenario, tax to GDP ratio is fixed.
So
where are the competing choices in that?
I think, Senator, that what that does is illustrate the choices that are available to the Australian community.